Everybody ready? Okay, awesome. Then I'll go ahead and get started. The majesty. Wait, do we have a timer?
Oh.
I got it. Go.
Okay, you're good. Okay. I was like, okay, I think we need to take time. Something's the same. Okay, then I guess another start. The majesty and the grandeur of the English language. It's the greatest possession we have. The most noble of thoughts that have ever flown through the hearts of men are contained within its extraordinary, imaginative, and musical mixtures of sound. And that's what you set yourself out to conquer, Liza, and conquer it you will. Professor Henry Higgins. In the play Pygmalion by George Bernard Shaw, Professor Henry Higgins, a master of the English language, attempts to teach Eliza Doolittle, a master of street slang, how to talk all proper. But learning how to speak English correctly presents its own set of challenges. Now, I personally struggle speaking the English language, although it's my native tongue. There's simply too many synonyms and antonyms that all sound the same. Ballistic, balsamic, succulent, corpulent, spoon and swoon, and yes, I've interchanged these words within sentences many times. But while studying English in more depth, I've discovered the reason behind this pressing and embarrassing problem. English has an elaborate history, which also gives it the most expansive vocabulary in the world. Now, we speak on average 16,000 words a day, and if we simply knew the history behind language generally, the history behind English specifically, and the history behind our words most importantly, then we would become effective communicators, and then we would conquer this beast that we call English. So what is the history behind language generally, and where do words come from? Well, many linguists and historians agree that until roughly 3500 BC, the ancient people groups in the Eastern Hemisphere all spoke a single language called Proto-Indo-European. Now, there's no record of this language, but it does explain the cultural similarities, the extensive trade, and the lexicographic parallels between civilizations that were separated by thousands of miles. But how did this one language evolve into hundreds of others? Well, around 3500 BC, the ancient people groups in the Eastern Hemisphere dispersed themselves across Asia, Europe, the Middle East, and Northern Africa. And why does that matter? Well, culture changes language. Because these people groups occupy different regions, they all developed their own distinct cultures and consequently their own distinct languages. Now, Francis Fanon, a world-renowned psychiatrist, philosopher, and revolutionary, once said, quote, "To speak a language is to take on a world, a whole new culture." So let's further examine the English language, then look at the cultural elements of society that it exposes. So we now know the history behind language generally, but what's the history behind our language, the English language? Well, as we all know, a society and a culture can change in an instant. 9/11 forever marked the personal lives of millions and the policies that actually affected billions. But events like this also leave profound impacts on the language that we speak. So in order to understand how cultural events actually change and impact our language, let's first familiarize ourselves with these three dates: 400 AD, 1066, and 1600. Now, these are the three landmarks for English civilization and language. Now, from 35 BC to 400 AD, the Romans ruled over the Britons in modern-day, you guessed it, Britain. And during this time period, the Britons actually adopted the Roman languages called Latin and Greek. But the Romans left around 400 AD due to a crisis in Italy, and the Angles and the Saxons, two Germanic tribes who both spoke German, promptly moved in and conquered the Briton people. Now, as a result of this power change, we get Latin and Greek from the Romans and German from the Angles and the Saxons mixed together, or Old English. Old English was spoken until roughly 1066, and it sounds roughly like now, in modern English, this translates to, "Listen of the spear danes in the days of yore, of those kings heard of their glory, how those nobles performed courageous deeds." Now, Old English and modern English barely seem to resemble, but it was the English of the time spoken until roughly 1066, or the Norman Conquest. When William the Conqueror invaded, he not only introduced a new political system, but also a new language called French. So we now have a Latin, Greek, German, and French-based language called Middle English. Middle English was spoken until roughly 1600, and it sounds like one that apple the shori short. So the Jutamata pesiterator and bid the riven was swish like your avish fringe endures the floor. Now in modern English, this translates to One April, with his shower sweet with fruit, the drought march hath pierced into the root, and hath bathed every vein with a cure that has power, which then produced the flower. Now, this is sounding a little bit more like the English that we speak today, but Middle English was spoken and developed during the Renaissance time period, which was a time of sophisticated thought and great innovation. But as a result of this movement, authors like Chaucer and Malory actually experimented with word roots, word function, and sentence structure. But Shakespeare, among other authors, actually ushered in modern English around 1600 by adding over 10,000 new words to the English vocabulary. And from that point on, we have been speaking modern English. Now, English's history is much more complex than this because so many more events have left long-lasting impacts on this language that we speak. So we now know the history behind language generally, and English specifically, but what's the history behind our words most importantly? Well, Old, Middle, and Modern English words alike had and have a distinct purpose and story behind them. Precarious, from Old English, currently means something that is dangerous and uncertain, but the actual Latin word elements mean something else entirely. The Latin base prec means prayer, and the suffix arius means pertaining to. So etymologically, the word precarious means pertaining to prayer. But how could that be dangerous and uncertain? Well, the Romans had a polytheistic pantheon, or simply more gods than they could keep up with. Praying to one god might offend another, and praying for the wrong thing might offend all the gods together. So to the Romans, praying was, in modern terms, precarious. Now let's travel to 1600. What is a cell? Well, if you're a science buff, you might immediately think of the basic unit of all life, but if history's more your thing, you might consider the cells monks lived in during the Renaissance time period. But actually, a cell in its scientific sense was inspired by the cells monks lived in. How? Well, at the end of the Renaissance time period, Robert Hooke built a microscope, and under that microscope he put a small piece of cork. What he actually saw through the lens resembled the cells monks lived in, so naturally he named this basic unit of all life a cell. Now, this word actually represents a time when church and science could finally coexist. Their feuds during the Reformation and Renaissance time periods had finally come to a close, and the church and science could finally work together for common goals. Now let's fast forward to the 90s and look at the word man cave. This word first entered the English language in 1992, and it means, quote, a room or area of the house regarded as a place of refuge for the man or the men of the household. Now, on a more serious note, during the late 80s and early 90s, America's divorce rate climbed to record highs. Couples weren't just divorcing for the first time, but records actually show an increase of divorce for the second, third, and even fourth time round. Now, this separated culture produced this broken word. No wonder why men needed to find a cynical name for their place of refuge in their very own homes. Now, each of these words shows a specific thing about a past culture, but these were just 3 words. Imagine the wealth of knowledge we would gain if we deciphered all of the words within the English vocabulary. Now, English has a little bit of everything in it. It has Malay, Aboriginal, Russian, Hindi, Portuguese. Trust me, the list continues. Unless we devote our whole life to linguistic and phonetic studies, this puzzle we call English will simply never be solved. But we can do the best we can with what we have. Now, I'm still infamous for saying the wrong word at the wrong time, and trust me, at my age, I am still learning English, and I'm only a beginner. But God puts distinct callings on each of our lives. He's called me to be a doctor, but He's called others to be lawyers, pastors, politicians, entrepreneurs, and even mothers and fathers. But with each of these distinct occupations and callings, we must be able to effectively communicate with other people. And simply a few words can either lead to our destruction or even to our salvation. Now, former Congressman Todd Akin was called to be a politician, but when he used one wrong term, illegitimate rape, his chances of ever holding a political office again vanished. But on the flip side, 2 words can account for my salvation. Jesus saves. Knowing the English language thoroughly not only translates into our social and our personal lives, but it also plays a key role in fulfilling our God-given purpose in life. Now, if we want to become those powerful communicators, those powerful leaders, and those powerful influencers in today's society, we must know what words to use, and we must know how to use those words well. And to do that, we must set out to conquer the English language. Now, just as Professor Henry Higgins said to Eliza, as she aspired to conquer the English language, I say to us that we must set out to conquer the English language, and if we do, conquer it, we will. Thank you very much.